Alright, so we are here talking in our second video here on the Cold War. So what we're going over today is primarily President Truman in the Cold War. So we're looking at his policies and actions that took place to combat communism abroad. So we're looking at foreign issues, not home issues. That's more for what we're going to talk about in the next section for President Truman. So imagine that the year is 1947. So we've talked about the differences between communism. We've talked about the differences between communism and the United States. And democracy and capitalism. That was in the previous video, in the previous lesson. And so we kind of know what each side wants. Neither side really trusts each other. They both want peace, but neither one of them is really understanding where the other side is coming from. There is mistrust on both ends. And the only two world powers left at this point are the United States and the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. All right, so they've agreed to kind of split up Germany. They've agreed to the reparations, but the idea of what are we going to do about the rest of Europe? While they've agreed to that, the Soviet Union doesn't exactly want to back down from what it's gained in terms of allies and setting up communist countries. All right, so that's kind of the position that we're in. So in 47, communism is beginning to spread not only across Western Europe but the entire world. If you're Truman, what if anything should you do about it? And why should the U.S. react about it? Or react in a way to think about. So that's something to kind of just gauge your thinking as we kind of get going here. All right. So one thing to really play in mind. So at the end of World War II, the United States is the first country to achieve and use a nuclear bomb, and we do that with the help of the British and some German scientists, i.e., Albert Einstein's part of that, and a few others that have escaped Germany prior to the start of the war. All right, Germany was the country we feared was going to get it. We knew that at some point the Soviet Union is going to develop their own. And scientists were thinking probably maybe the mid-1950s, not 1949 when they actually do detonate it. All right, so that in essence changes the whole dynamic of the Cold War. But there are other things that precede that in terms of the threat that the Soviet Union and communism pose to the United States, or what we think they pose. So Winston Churchill, the former prime minister, kind of in between his prime minister duties, because he's not prime minister from like 46 to like 52 or something, comes to the United States, visits the United States, and says in his visit that there is essentially two Europe's. All right, there's a Iron Curtain defense, essentially saying this is where the Soviets have drawn the line between communism and the free world and democracies, between these two sides. And the way that we represent that are two organizations that developed a couple years later in 1949 and 1950 that separate them. So there's NATO, which still exists today, North American Atlantic Treaty Organization, that represents the democratic Western Europe. So think West Germany, Belgium, Great Britain, France. It also includes the United States and Canada in there, and communist Eastern Europe with what's known as the Warsaw Pact. All right, and they fear each other, and so essentially it's another defensive organization for each side. Okay? And so what the United States develops is this policy based on what we looked, or those documents that we briefly mentioned at the end of the last video that we would have gone more in depth with in class if we had time, but we don't. So what that came to with George Kennan's long telegram, what that really looked like, was he outlined a policy of what we call containment. Okay, so this is the idea of where we try to keep communism where it is. We're not going to actively try and put communism out. And what we mean by putting communism out, like we're not going to go into communist countries and try and overthrow their governments, or at least that's the idea anyway, but to prevent it from spreading. So in places like Eastern Europe, like in Poland, Romania, those places have unfortunately already fallen into communism. We're not going to step in there, unfortunately. We can't. We fear war with the Soviet Union if we do that, but we can prevent it from spreading in other locations, especially if we think that other democracies are in danger of falling to communism, especially if they are, believing to fall to communism under, mysterious circumstances like influences of the Soviet Union, or money being thrown in, or weapons being thrown in from the Soviet Union or supporting countries. So the idea is if we contain communism, it will eventually fade away. All right? And this becomes the long-standing U.S. policy, or the baseline for the U.S. policy for how we act in the Cold War abroad, even inside the United States to an extent too. That as long as we prevent the spread, communism will fade away on its own. So this is something to keep in mind for the rest of the unit is how true does this become and how does this explain U.S. actions? All right. So part of what George Kennan wrote in that long telegram, little excerpt here, the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. So consider long-term, patient, firm, vigilant. Okay, so it's going to last a long time. We got to be very patient about it. We do have to, be like a parent here and, be very patient with the child, but we got to be firm with what we do, and we have to be always aware, that's the vigilant part, about Russian expansive tendencies and what they are going to do with expanding communism. So President Truman, all right, comes up with this idea for a doctrine, which is also going to go with this policy of containment here, that we're going to support the free peoples that are resisting rebellions or outside forces known as communism that try to conquer them. All right, so anytime that a communist revolution is happening, or the threat of communist revolution is happening, or we believe that there are outside forces supporting communist countries or groups, or sorry, not countries, but communist organizations or people in other countries that are trying to overthrow democracies, then it is the United States' duty to step in. And again, this is something essential, these two ideas are really, really important in the long term about how the United States reacts and takes action here in the Cold War. So for the Truman Doctrine, this takes many different forms. So diplomatic means, so this means meeting with different governments. There are also economic ones, with what we're going to talk about with the Marshall Plan here, and loans, and military actions to deter expansion. So essentially, this is what we're going to use. These are going to be the main tools at our disposal, and every president and every administration is going to use these differently to combat and prevent the spread of communism. All right, so with loans, with the Marshall Plan is the belief that if we do these, the communism will fall apart on its own, and that if we give money to help these countries rebuild and to stabilize their economies, keep people happy, then they're not going to turn to communism. All right? Because if people are happy, if they like their way of life, then communism will fall on its own. So here's kind of our idea of the NATO countries in blue, or the countries that eventually all join NATO, and on the red are all your communist Soviet-packed countries. Yugoslavia is a communist country on its own, but became communist before the Soviet Union intervened at the end of World War II. They kind of freed themselves and made their own communist country. But they are independent of the Soviet Union. So you can kind of read this in the presentation. All right, it's going to be in the notes. Essentially, they are talking about frequent protests and coercion and intimidation in violation of the Yalta Agreement in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, about where the Soviet Union has essentially created totalitarian governments. Other countries have been in similar developments. Okay, it is the policy of the United States to support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities. So essentially saying that these communist groups are the minority, which was very true in many cases, especially in Poland, where it was a very small group of people supporting the Soviet Union. And people who wanted democracy were not able to get back in there, especially veterans who had fought against the Nazis in other countries. All right, so free Polish forces. So you believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way, and should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour using economic and financial aid, including military stuff, to become stable, it will be a very long and hard road for the United States as well as other countries. So when we look at Greece and Turkey, they're facing communist revolutions in the 47 and 48, and so the United States props them up. It helps them with that. So we send military aid and money to prevent them from taking over each country, and it is very successful. In 1948, with the threat, let me just check time here, 9 times. So we got about 6 minutes. So in Berlin, remember that Berlin is split between, the 4 sections, okay, of the British, the American, the French sector, as well as the German sector, or sorry, not the German sector, the Soviet sector. So the German capital is split into, 4 sections, okay, essentially 3 democratic sections and 1 communist section. And Berlin, if you know the location, we'll show a map here, is essentially in the heart of East Germany. It is a long way away from West Germany and other support. So, believing that there's a plan to reunite Germany and that the Soviets want to take all of Germany, or at least keep it separate, they surround West Berlin, pretty much cutting off access from the roads and from the waterways into the city. All right, and they pretty much want West Berlin to fall and become part of Eastern Germany and East Berlin. So the United States, again, facing this threat of, okay, what are we going to do? We can't just abandon Berlin, or we could abandon Berlin, but this could also precipitate war if we continue to try and force our way in. So the solution that Truman comes up with is we are going to keep West Berlin alive. We're going to prevent them from surrendering. We're not going to pull our own forces out, even though the Soviets are trying to starve us out and maybe even start war over it. We're going to fly planes in consistently until the Soviets give up on their blockade. So it shows American resolve, again, with the Marshall Plan on that. All right, so there's a little video if you want to watch that presentation on it. Okay. However, inside of China, which has been dealing with a communist revolution since before World War II. World War II actually is what saves the Chinese Communist Party because they were very close to being heavily defeated and ending. World War II saves them because that way they have to fight with the democratic forces. The democratic forces have to fight with the communists against Japan. After World War II, this revolution continues. The United States is still supporting the Western or the more democratic side, which is actually just a more totalitarian regime that claims it's a democracy. It doesn't work very well, and so very disorganized. They're just kind of using American funds, and again, it's not going very well. That China, as we know today, becomes communist by winning this long revolution in 1949. And the United States did give military aid. We did give money to the other side of China. But again, it was very unsuccessful because of the way things were administered. There was more resolve within the communist group, and so when you know of the country Taiwan, that is essentially what was left of the democratic version of China, which leads to a lot of long-standing issues. At the same time, we're also heavily building into Japan, treats it like West Germany, to ensure that Japan doesn't fall under communist forces. So the Marshall Plan here, let's take a look at the time here, okay, goes like this, okay? This is all the money, about $13 billion in economic support to help rebuild the European economies after the war. We offer it to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, but they prevent the aid. All right, essentially thinking that the United States is trying to undermine it. It's named after this guy, General George C. Marshall, who helped kind of essentially build up the United States military during World War II and make sure that we were able to send supplies everywhere. So this is where we send most of our money, okay? West Germany, France, Great Britain, after the war. And again, we even put money into these other countries, again, to prevent that spread and make sure that they are strong and economically stable so that they don't turn to communism. Okay. Some info on the Berlin airlift. So here is Berlin. Here are the British zone, the American zone. There are about 3 or 4 airports that they're able to fly into. So think that in 10 months, over almost 280,000 flights, 600 a day. Okay, 32 planes are always in the air at one time. Planes arriving and departing, once it's efficient, every 90 seconds to keep them fed, keep them well clothed, make sure they have fuel and supplies. So then we're going to try and quickly wrap up here, the next minute and a half, about Korea. All right, so Korea is located here inside on the border of China, the small border here with the Soviet Union. It was split at the end of World War II. It was a Japanese colony from the early 1900s. And so when Russia declares war on Japan at the very end of the war, essentially we flood troops into the southern part of Korea, they fled troops into the northern part, and that's where we get a split between communist north, democratic south, when Korea had never been separated ever as a country. So that's why we divided at the 38th parallel, because of that separation at the very end of the war. So Russia declaring war is essentially why Korea is split. Both sides want to unify Korea, and North Korea invades the South in 1950, and then the United Nations steps up and gets involved for the very first time as a organization, because while there's a Security Council, the Soviet Union does not vote in opposition because they're not there. They are angry that China, which is now communist, doesn't get a seat at the table. They give it to Taiwan, which then we'll talk about later. So the North Koreans launched the surprise attack, essentially decimating UN forces, primarily South Korean forces. But then there is this miracle where we put in all our troops, or put in a lot of troops at the end of and then retake much of South Korea, try to invade North Korea. But Communist China threatened to go in, which they did. And so that's what leads to a long-term stalemate and why we're at where we are at today. So there's more info on that. Look at the